Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Adrian Bonenberger. Adrian, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. My name is Adrian Bonenberger. I'm an independent candidate for governor of Connecticut, former writer, Army veteran, journalist, and currently teach English up in Springfield College, Springfield, Massachusetts.
Well, thank you for coming on today. So this is somewhat unusual for this program because I've never had someone running for office before as a guest. And so we should note that. And also, we should note that you and I know each other a little bit. And I edited a couple pieces that you wrote when I was an opinion editor at The Hill. This is not, I guess, a purely disinterested interview, but, putting that out there. Okay, well, so I knew you as someone who was very interested in the war in Ukraine and wrote some pieces about that for The Hill. And then I heard that you were running for governor of Connecticut, and I was surprised. So why are you running for governor of Connecticut?
Yeah, the chief platform, the mainstay of my platform is establishing a large voluntary state guard. The number that I've come up with is 15 to 20,000. A state guard that operates the way the National Guard used to before it was really fully federalized, as it has been. So something that's for disaster relief, but also for security at the state level. That came out of work that I did on a memoir that I have written and not published and may never be published. It's 37,500 words. And as I'm told by agents, you really need a memoir to be 60,000 words to publish it. I'm done writing it. It's 37,500 and it's not going to get longer than that. So there it is. So I was doing some research for that into the history, not specifically of Connecticut, but of New England, because I understood there used to be much larger voluntary mechanisms in the New England area and also in the United States, but specifically New England, where I'm from. And that was connected to my experiences in Ukraine. Ukraine, for folks who may not be aware of kind of what their secret power is, I think a lot of people, if asked, you know, what Ukraine is about or why it's special right now, they'd probably say drones or drone innovation. That's something that's captured a lot of headlines. But something that I saw reporting there starting in 2015, up to about 2023, 24. I could even say 22 because I guess I stopped reporting when I took a side in the conflict and joined the Ukrainians to train troops, to train civilians and train troops. But the secret sauce to them really is a combination of decentralization. So letting power out down from the federal level down to the oblast, which is their version of state, and town and city level, and also volunteers. And that volunteer power is not something that we're familiar with it, but it's not something we're conditioned to look at as essential to defense because we're a wealthy country, far wealthier than Ukraine, and our power tends to be expressed through tax dollars. So I think most people would say the US military can handle any conflict, and that's why, it's like the meme, right? Like this is why we don't have healthcare. It's like it's a bunch of aircraft carriers and F-35s. And there's a lot of truth to that. But but I think it's actually more precarious than people know. And so in the process of researching that and writing about it and thinking about it, I came to learn that there was, I think, a real need at the local level for a mechanism like the State Guard. And so that's why I'm running.
Okay, so are you sort of a single issue candidate in the way that like I don't know, I'm trying to think of other ones. Someone maybe would run like Steve Forbes, like the flat tax was his thing. Are you this is your one issue and and that's why you're running to publicize this issue or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I not the first and probably not the last to favorably compare myself to Steve Forbes. I mean, an American Titan, a visionary.
Yeah, still he's still alive, isn't he? I think. Maybe our younger viewers and listeners don't remember Steve Forbes. He ran for president twice, maybe in the '90s, and he's the son of Malcolm Forbes, who was a publishing magnate, and yeah, he had this idea for a flat tax, and that was what he was pushing.
hailed as a visionary in some corners, to which I'm not privy. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm of two minds about it because on the one hand, yeah, this is like the key to my platform. I think a voluntary state guard is actually a vehicle for decentralization. There's a lot more to the voluntary state guard than the state guard itself. It's something that is it's really more like a constitutionally guaranteed mechanism for volunteering in a certain type of way with a certain type of access to power, that people aren't used to thinking about in the United States. People are used to thinking about freedom of speech as power and protest as power and voting and organizing as power. And at least, I was a Democrat for a long time. I'm running as an independent. The right has always been the part of American politics where you see the ability to do violence as a type of power. They're not wrong about that. In fact, and I think what I've learned campaigning is that there's a lot of people on the left and in the Democratic Party now, and I think this is why why I'm the perfect guest for culturally determined what is not just driving our culture now, but ways in which frustration are being expressed nationally and internationally. People see now that there is this kind of you have to deal with the potential of violence in the political arena and the political landscape. That's Venezuela, that's Iran, that is the president using the National Guard over the objection of governors and mayors who say we do not want the National Guard here. We're good. And because the president has a monopoly, not a virtual monopoly, an actual monopoly on violence, the president can say, go here, do this, go here, do that. And the active duty, National Guard becomes active duty when the president commands them, is compelled to do that. I think a lot of people are beginning to wake up to the possibility, certainly our age, I would say, people in their 40s and 50s and younger, are beginning to say maybe we have gone too far to the side of like we don't think about power as violence. We think about power as the power of the pen, the power of writing. I do believe in the power of the pen, the power of writing, but I think looking at how things are working right now, maybe the founders were actually just like literally right when they wrote the Second Amendment the way they did.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions. Okay, well, one is let's talk more about state guard because when you contacted me and said that this was your issue, I don't think I knew I had heard that term before. I mean, so there's the National Guard and state. I mean, what's the technical term? A state National Guard, or National Guard of a certain state, and then there's the militia, like the state militias that existed in like the 18th and 19th century, that joined the Civil War because there wasn't a standing federal army. And please correct me on if any of this is wrong. So what is a state guard, and how would it be different than what currently exists as state National Guards?
Yeah, you broke it down really well. Is you've got the old model was based on this vision that the founders had of a very small standing army and a large militia. I think the way federalism was originally envisioned by the framers, the founders, it was the ability to use violence, either military violence or law enforcement violence. And I think it's important to note here for listeners that those two were the same for the founders. When they wrote the First to the 10th Amendments, some of the amendments that had to do with justice and law enforcement, illegal search and seizure, and the Second Amendment, they envisioned the same person, which was a British redcoat, because you didn't have professional law enforcement until the mid 19th century in cities, and then early 20th century for a lot of towns. So law enforcement and the military was the same for them, and they sought to constrain that power federally. I think they wanted that to be a negotiation. They wanted it to be something where if it's important enough for the United States to go to war, for the president to say, we're going to go to war with country X, then it had to be, hey, how many troops can I get for this Connecticut? How many troops can I get for this Virginia? How many troops can I get for this New York? Because the standing army wasn't big enough to just go it alone. You just couldn't you could tackle the Barbary pirates, but you couldn't tackle Germany or Great Britain. And that's an interesting way of thinking about the ability to do, to use violence, coercive violence, internationally or nationally. I don't know how to answer the question of sort of the bifurcation between military power and law enforcement power federally. There's the ATF, there's which the right hates to this day because of Waco, because of Ruby Ridge. There's ICE, which the left has now developed a passionate contempt for based on recent events. There's the FBI, the center of many conspiracies. And I think that genie is just kind of out of the bottle. I don't know how to constrain that power, honestly. But I do think that federally, anyway, you can begin to constrain the military capacity of the United States and the ability of the executive to go and do things unilaterally by standing up this mechanism. It used to be the National Guards were that state force. And you can see a trajectory where that state force goes from being like a thing that doesn't participate in wars in the American Revolution. So the Connecticut State Guard, the Connecticut militia, Connecticut State Militia, can't be federalized in the same way that the National Guard can. In the American Revolution, there was a debate in the legislature as to whether or not it would be sent to help in the campaign again to stop General Burgoyne up in Saratoga. This is one of the big battles in the Revolutionary War. And by the time the legislature voted, yes, we will send Connecticut's state militia out of the boundaries of Connecticut or over the border to help New York with this, we'd already won. So it became a moot point. And that militia over time became something that could be, mobilized directly. World War I, World War II. By the time it became the National Guard in Vietnam, although it was the National Guard, it was still seen as primarily the domain of states. So only 9,000 National Guardsmen served in Vietnam, and most of them were Air National Guard. There were 150. There was one company, 150 National Guard infantrymen who from Indiana, and the infantry was all male at that time, so they were infantrymen who were sent to Vietnam. We don't know exactly how many served in the global wars on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands. So you go from 9,000 in the 60s and 70s to hundreds of thousands between 2001 and 2000 and 2021, and they are an essential part of the global apparatus now. The last two casualties of 2025 were National Guardsmen who were killed in Syria by an ISIS sort of dude. And the first four casualties in the war in Iran were National Guardsmen and reservists who were killed in Kuwait when Iran did their initial bombardment with drones. And I think at this point you just have to say, I'm not anti-National Guard. I'm not trying to say that, but you have to acknowledge that that's not really a state asset anymore. That belongs to the federal government. It belongs to the Pentagon, and it doesn't respond to the governors. It doesn't respond to states. It can, but not necessarily. And if it comes down to a tug of war between federal government and the state government, federal government wins every time. So states need a mechanism that is similar to but different from the National Guard in the sense that you need a way to be able to serve in your town, in your city, without having to worry that every 4 years you get a new president. This president really doesn't like China, and you thought that you were going to be in Bridgeport or New Haven, for 4 years, and it turns out you're there for 1 year, and then you spend 3 years, campaigning somewhere in China unexpectedly. So. Yeah, it's the National Guard has become a part of active duty, and I think a lot of people don't understand or realize that, but that's where it is.
So you made me think of mentioning Vietnam and the Air National Guard. That's George W. Bush served in the Texas Air National Guard, and that was seen as a way to avoid service in Vietnam. And the joke, circa 2000 was like he was protecting the Texas border from incursion from Oklahoma or whatever. So like why, if the states, we hope, are not going to war with each other ever again, like that happened once. What is the state guard like? So is the Connecticut State Guard defending the Connecticut border from Massachusetts, or is it responding to natural disasters, which is sort of what like the traditional understanding perhaps of what a state National Guard would do? Or is it involved in some possible standoff with the feds or or something like that? Like what role do you see, a state militia type organization serving in modern times?
First and foremost, it's disaster response. And I say that because that's kind of what the National Guard has been traditionally, certainly in my lifetime and before GWAT. It was there's flooding, there's some type of climate disaster, and you can depend on the National Guard to show up with big trucks that the police don't have and do stuff. I think, especially at a moment when it sounds like FEMA is going away uh, or becoming a bargaining chip so that if you happen to live in a blue state or a state with a governor, even a red state, but the governor happens not to, to be on the outs with Trump, FEMA might not help the state, or you might have to grovel to get help, which is unseemly and undemocratic and un-American. FEMA only works at the federal level, so it's not something that the state can just switch on its own. You can't you'd have to raise taxes a lot to fund a capacity like FEMA to backfill that. And REMAs don't work, regional emergency management agencies, because you have natural disasters of the type that the National Guard responds to or FEMA responds to regionally, like the blizzard that hit the Northeast. FEMA works because the blizzard didn't hit California. So California is subsidizing FEMA at the same time that, when the California wildfires hit, they weren't hitting Connecticut. So you can move FEMA around federally as needed. But a regional emergency management, if New England states were all paying into it, every New England state would have needed it when the blizzard hit. So it just doesn't. It's not the cost doesn't. The financials don't line up the way they should. Thinking about that, you look at it and say, okay, so a large voluntary state guard, volunteers organized at a town and city level, that's not certainly in the short term. It's not adding anything to the budget. It's taxing people's time rather than their wallet, taxing their time for training and for organizing and for responding. In the blizzard, for example, that hit recently, I know a lot of streets had people where if there was an elderly couple or someone older in a house, folks would just go down and help that person shovel out their driveway. That happened on my street. It would probably be something like that for disaster response. But I do think, like you said about it's certainly not standoff with the feds because the feds are going to win that standoff. I think the way it ends up contesting federal power, it's not directly, it's indirectly. It's that a lot of the desire for the federal government to come into cities, for example, with ICE or with the National Guard, reflects a kind of misunderstanding of how those cities and how towns organize their own defense, organize their own law enforcement. And I think it's people who tend to have that type of thing in mind, people on the right who might just have too much time on their hands. If they feel unsafe because they're watching on Fox News that Los Angeles has turned into, a violent wasteland similar to, Escape from Los Angeles, and it's just gangs, going back and forth across the city. If they legitimately believe that's the case, then of course they're going to support, the National Guard being sent there or wherever else. But if instead of being in front of Fox News, they are training in a unit alongside people from, people in a city, so people in Darien thinking, people in Darien work in New York. So that's a bad example. But people in Darien saying, oh, Chicago's, a terrible crime wasteland. Instead of thinking that, they're working next to people from Bridgeport to secure their region. So they're not thinking about that in those terms. They're being exposed to different people. They're being exposed to different places in different contexts. And I think opening up, reducing partisanship and opening up dialogue for understanding different viewpoints and different perspectives, which was certainly my experience in the military.
Right, and we didn't mention this explicitly, but you served in the military. If you want to give whatever details you want about your service, please do so. But yeah, so you have experience in this area.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. I was yeah, Army veteran. I did 7 years, a little under 7 years in the U.S. Army infantry. I did 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan. I did, and then I helped train folks in Ukraine between 2022 and 2023. Um, I went on a podcast recently, and somebody asked me basically point blank, is like, look, do you have PTSD? And is this idea, this militia idea of yours, like basically an expression of PTSD? And you're just one of those guys who's like always worried about stuff collapsing. And I mean, I don't think so. I think I'm probably I am, because of my weird experiences in life, less so my deployments to Afghanistan and more the experience of watching Afghanistan collapse precipitously. And yes, to a certain extent, my front row seat to what was happening in Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine. That's changed my perspective. But I don't think that I have any less PTSD than the founders who were mostly veterans of the French Indian War and the American Revolution, and who wrote this stuff for I think pretty good reasons. I think the possibility of violence happening to you. You mentioned this earlier, our state's going to go to war with each other. I don't think so. Certainly not New England, certainly not, Connecticut, New York, that sort of thing. It's a joke. We share the same culture, but I do think it is, albeit a distant, it is a possibility that you could see the type of wide scale, large, disruption in the United States, and a kind of a contest between regions, not militarily, but regions in the federal government. You could see, because anytime you get a centralizing impulse, such as the one that Trump has had, which is very polarizing, the thing that happens afterwards is, the water comes in and then the water goes out, and people are pulling on that. And that's, that's what partisanship is doing these days. And I don't think the Democrats have been very effective at contesting that, unfortunately. Both parties tend to sort of benefit from partisanship. Over the long term, what that does is that does create, incredible pressure on the federal government. And I think it's possible not that we would be fighting each other, but that there could be some type of, if not civil war, civil conflict. In that case, you wouldn't want a large voluntary state guard or a militia to participate in that. You would want it, you'd want Connecticut to have one in New York and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, or on the sort of Swiss model, where it's like, this is a very large pointy nail. And if there are disruptions happening in other parts of the United States, we can say, don't bring that up here. That is kind of like here, we have our New England Yankee culture. We're multicultural, we're diverse. We're not, there's no single, tent pole that defines us, and we like it like that. That's how we like things. We've always been that way from the very beginning. And so we're capable of defending that if parts of the United States do end up falling into some kind of greater disaster. I'm not saying that's going to happen. Chicken Little, the sky's falling, the sky's falling, but it does feel a lot more possible to me than it did in, say, the 1990s. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Maybe we should bracket that because, could there be a civil war in America? And in fact, I'm just remembering now you wrote a piece that I edited that was somewhat on that theme, that was related to the movie Civil War that came out in 2024, and they put out this map that was sort of like imagining America splitting apart, and you were writing about how that's not what a civil war in the modern era would look like, and we'll perhaps link to that article. But okay, but so what you're describing, what sort of weapons do these people have? You said it was volunteer. Are they using their own weapons, or are they getting weapons from someone else? And if it's their own weapons, then they can't have tanks or howitzers or things like that. And yeah, if you're just responding to natural disasters, you don't need military hardware, I don't think. I mean, big trucks could be helpful, but you don't need submachine guns unless there's like a total breakdown of civil order or something like that. So yeah, what are they packing heat, or are they bringing their own, or what?
I mean, I think the Second Amendment folks would say, the text of the Second Amendment is the well-regulated militia depends on people who keep and bear their own arms. That's the text of that's what the Constitution says. That's the Second Amendment. And I think my take on that is decentralizing this power from the federal government to the state government level. I immediately want to decentralize it to the town and city level, recognizing that, the northeast of Connecticut is on a different planet from the southwest of Connecticut. The southwest of Connecticut, Gold Coast, Darien, Greenwich, a lot of wealth. People who are for the most part working in the city or retired from work in the city. They're Yankees fans. Northeast of Connecticut, the Red Sox fans. It's very rural. I was in some towns that didn't even have a police department. Their police response force was the state police, and it was like 10 to 15 minutes away. And so when the police are, for me, the police are like, a couple minutes away. We have a police force, a police department in Branford, Connecticut, local police department. It's about 55 people, and that's perfectly adequate to cover, a town of 28,000. But you live in, Plainfield or, Danielson or Pomfret, which are towns of thousands of residents. You have a different attitude toward things. So I wouldn't want to determine how a town or a city musters folks, how it organizes them, or how it organizes the rifles. I suspect a red town in the northeast of Connecticut would say, you have the right to keep and bear arms and you ought to. And so you have your firearms, and this is the firearm that the state guard says that we use. So you need to get one of those if you don't have it. And we'll train together with that type of ammunition when we're training. And then when we're training for disaster response, we'll train on disaster response. A town like Brantford, Connecticut, like mine, would probably vote to, have an armory in the police department. And that's where the guns live, whatever the guns are. And when we go to train, when the unit goes to train, that's when the guns in the armory get, brought to the range and issued to people. But that's how it was in the active duty too. Like when I was in the United States, when I was on Fort Drum, I didn't carry a gun around. I would like on a gun range day, the guns would be issued to you and you'd either march out to the range or sometimes they would be issued at the range itself. The ammunition would always be issued out at the range. You would fire it all at the range and then you would you'd clean your rifle and turn things in. So I think that depends on the culture of the place. I wouldn't want to have it be like this is the way it's got to be in any particular town or city. I think that's something where folks would want to make that determination collectively themselves. But yeah, I mean, like things like machine guns and stuff like that, there are people who own machine guns right now. I don't know what it's like in New Jersey, but you have to pay a license fee and you got to own it, and you've got to like get some type of license and it's annual and you have to fill out all sorts of paperwork. It's so much more of a hassle than to me feels like it's worth it. Like I'm not a gun owner, actually. If I was, it wouldn't be a machine gun. It'd be like a pistol or a rifle or something.
Okay, so you envision this being both town by town or municipality by municipality and the state level. So how does that work? So like you said, there's blue and red, liberal and conservative, rural and urban and suburban parts of every state, and they can, maybe in the same way that they run their police stations sort of in the way they want to. But if you imagine the entire state coming together, or the volunteers from the entire state coming together, then you need some sort of cohesion if they're responding in an organized way, right? So how do you see that working?
I'm not sure exactly. I think it's going to be something where it's because I do want to, decentralize as much power and authority as possible. I think it's the way I see it, and that can certainly evolve as more people get involved. Is you decentralize, you give towns and cities, municipalities as much power and agency as possible at the grassroots and let them develop their plan. And then it's a conversation between the voluntary state guard as it exists, a very, very light footprint at the state level, mostly just to make final determinations about guidelines. at the state level, it would not be necessary unless we were at some sort of war, unless there was some sort of, civil war or world war, where we were faced by invasion. Those things are very, I would say, far-fetched. Not impossible, but far-fetched. So for the most part, it's I think the lifeblood is going to be at the town and city level, and the state level could be a couple dozen people, maybe a dozen, half a dozen people working full time, and everybody else is either part time or volunteering. And then it's just there to get together to say, like, okay, we've got these 7 different proposals on what the uniform is supposed to look like. It's going to be blue. Like, we
Okay,
have to
okay,
make it all.
but
It's going to be blue.
okay. So if people volunteer and sign up for this, are they making the sort of commitment that they'd make if they volunteer for the military and say that if they are called to serve, they like have to, or they get put in prison or something like that? What if there's a natural disaster on one end of Connecticut and the people on the other end are like, well, we're kind of too busy dealing with our own stuff over here. We don't want to be called up and sent over to Greenwich to bail them out. So what is, what are the responsibilities of people who do this?
This is the other beautiful thing about the voluntary state guard, and it's stipulated directly in Connecticut's general statutes. Because you're not compensating voluntary guards, they have the final call, the final determination. It's up to every citizen whether they show up or not. So I think what you would do is, you would say, I want a commitment from you for 4 years. 4 years is the term of your service. And if you, serve whatever the number is, maybe if you show up for 80% of the training or 90% of the training, you show up for most of the things that we call for as a volunteer, not being compensated, then you get this ribbon or whatever. You have officially served for the time. There's no compulsory mechanism. And I think that's actually a really powerful thing, because it tells the citizen, hey, if there's a hurricane and Greenwich is getting smacked pretty hard and they call for, we need help from all over the state, but you've gotten hit pretty hard in New London too. Maybe not as hard as Greenwich, but pretty hard. And you're like, I'd like to get down there, but we got to like clear the fallen trees off of our streets first, so we can't help out. Yeah, you're not going to go to prison. No one's going to slap you on the wrist. No one's going to think any less of you. It's like, if you can't come, you can't come. And that means it requires citizens to buy into it or not. That's also a great check on tyranny. If you get some kind of crazy governor and the state guard is powerful and it's been around for a while, and the voluntary state guard is, an important part of the culture. And this governor says, we are in fact going to take Long Island. Long Island used to be part of Connecticut colony, and it's time to bring it back to Connecticut, make Connecticut great again. Then a dozen people are going to show up and be like, we're with you. We agree. That's a good idea. And the rest of the people are going to be like, that's insane. No.
Okay. So the governor is the commander in chief of the state guard as well?
The governor, in their capacity as captain general of the organized and unorganized militias, is how the terminology reads in the Connecticut general statutes.
Okay. And are these are things that date back to like Revolutionary War times, or because is Ned Lamont a captain general, or is that who the governor is? Governor of Connecticut is now? He doesn't wear a uniform or have epaulets or anything, right?
He doesn't. And I'd say a governor who starts wearing a uniform, to include myself, should be viewed with extreme suspicion, bordering on hostility.
Right.
Yeah, the captain general is like, that's not a real rank in active duty military. It's just like, it's something that was made up. I think, yeah, it was probably relevant, Revolutionary wartime, or before. I mean, I think it predates the revolution, even. And it's just something that's, we have lieutenant generals, and we have major generals and brigadier generals, and then there are generals. There's no captain general. So it does seem to be this weird old-timey kind of thing. But I think that's why it exists in that specific role. It is this very conditional, like quasi-political thing where it's like, look, you're not issuing orders. If the captain general of the state guard is saying, all right, our plan is to create a pincer movement around New York City, flanking and fixing, something has gone terribly awry. But in their capacity as governor and captain general of the unorganized and organized militias, there's a way to organize a defense, essentially. I mean, I just don't. I think the amount of training that one needs to perform competently and capably on the offense requires an active duty military, and that's why we have the military we do today, because it takes so much time and effort to do combined arms. I think air, land, sea battle is I'm not sure exactly what doctrine we're using today, but it's some variation on combined arms, which means the infantry practices for a year, and then at the end of the year, they go down to a training area, and you do a training area with the tanks and the artillery and the helicopters and the planes, so that, if you need to use that at war, you can. It's really tough to do. It's tough to do at tempo. A voluntary state guard would have like a couple weeks a year to train, and it would be training part-time disaster relief, first aid, first responder, emergency management stuff, and part-time on just like marksmanship, small unit tactics, small unit leadership. That's sufficient for war on the defense, I think, especially over time. If you've served for 4 years or 8 years in the Guard, you'll have some sense of how to hold territory. But that doesn't imagine a scenario where the Guard is ever being used offensively. Also, another check on tyranny that I like, in addition to the citizen being able to say, I want nothing to do with that, and having zero repercussions socially or legally.
Okay, I'm thinking, what is the hierarchy here? It seems like the military is extremely hierarchical organization. What you're describing sounds more like a weekend club where you can sort of like I'm not feeling well today, I'm going to skip practice or something, and then who is telling who what to do, and what do you do with people who are saying, no, I think we should go do this thing over there? Like, who's making these decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. The way I see this working, embedded with what we currently have in Connecticut, is depending on where the state guard is being mobilized. Let's say there is a kind of, local emergency in the southwest of Connecticut that needs additional volunteer power, and the voluntary state guard is mobilized, and the mayor of Greenwich, or the first selectmen of Greenwich and Darien and Cobb and Stamford, appeal to the governor. The governor says yes, mobilize the guards. Then the guards are, depending on the nature of that emergency, working with the fire department and or the police department and or the National Guard. And so in that case, I think they would be reporting to whatever agency is being used in that particular context. There aren't and can't be any consequences there are consequences for illegal activities. Like if someone were to break the law as a member of the state guard, they would face the same consequences as any citizen breaking the law, and would not be treated in any way above the law. And that would include, if they were assisting police officers. They are not police officers. They are state guard, or assisting the fire department. So they're not protected by, accountability protections that local police departments or state police have. But I think citizens tend to have a pretty decent, handle on what is legal versus what is not legal. People don't go around breaking the law all the time, and you would have.
I'm just imagining possible scenarios. So let's say there's some sort of emergency, and members of the state guard respond to it, and then there's an elderly woman who needs help, getting out of her house or something, and then some people are helping her, and then she falls down on the ice and she breaks her hip. Who does she sue? Or who is legally liable for that? And then sort of like any civic organization has some concern about legal liability, and we live in a very litigious society. So and people volunteer to work for the federal government because they have sovereign immunity, and this is a contested space, and it's like, how badly does an agent of the state have to act for them to lose their sovereign immunity is like actively being contested before the Supreme Court all the time. So, and who would volunteer for helping the old lady if they're personally liable if she breaks her hip, or any other possible number of things that could go wrong in either an emergency or just day-to-day life.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are valid points. I don't. I mean, those are also problems for helping people anyway. You know, it's like I don't think that a person who is going to help their elderly neighbor, get out of the house and walk down the sidewalk. They've tried to clear the ice off of it and salted it and everything else. Is going to do that whether they're a part of the state guard or not, or they're going to consider doing it. I think that what you said is exactly right. We are a litigious society, and that concerns us. We're always concerned about legal liability. Anytime something goes wrong, you think to yourself, how do I talk about this thing or envision this thing so that I am not potentially sued by somebody for something? My hope would be that as the state guard in the long term, as that is something that is, people serve in it, and there are more and more people who have served in it, and that type of volunteering, that idea spreads. It creates a sort of depressing effect on the litigiousness, so that you're not seeing people with frivolous lawsuits. There will always be frivolous lawsuits. There will always be people who try to abuse the law and take power not for good purposes but for bad purposes. So yeah, I mean, I think there isn't an easy answer for that, but I one thing I do want to get back to really quickly is in terms of organizing the guard itself. I think what I'd really like to do, which is a really exciting thing with this guard, is you very rarely get an opportunity to stand up a large military organization from scratch. And for that reason, every military is filled with these weird redundancies, like many people say that tanks are redundant in the United States military now because of drones, because you can take out a tank with a couple drones pretty easily. Other people say that it's not redundant, in the same way that maybe people were saying the cavalry wasn't redundant before World War One. Maybe, piloted aircraft are redundant, in an era of autonomous drones. It's not clear to me what is actually needed and what isn't, but standing it up and saying, okay, 15 to 20,000 people is what we want. Maybe 10,000 people show up, maybe 20,000 people show up, maybe 50,000 people show up, and they're responsible for organizing themselves. And I think you have the time and space, because we're not in a war right now, because we're not in the middle of a disaster, to let folks kind of build those units up iteratively. So maybe the first year, what happens is you hold elections and you say, who do we want to be the platoon leader going forward? Who do we want to be the company commander? Who do we want to be the battalion or brigade commander and the divisional commander? I would like to see a system where the citizens elect their leadership, and you do have this way of therefore elevating the most competent people, the people who are most dedicated, and that also, that serves also, I think, as a check on tyranny, and it incentivizes people to join a system where they know the odds of somebody being appointed who just kiss the right butts and always looks looks great to superiors, but is constantly screwing people over and throwing people under the bus. The odds of encountering a person like that are remarkably low, because they're not being appointed. And the odds of that being used politically also, it's sort of like a cynosphere. Well, if you support me as governor for the state of Connecticut, then I'll make you the general. So you just raise some money for me, and you hook me up, I'll hook you up. It's not going to be like that. So I think it's because you're making this thing that doesn't currently exist. There are all sorts of interesting opportunities to let people express themselves locally. The units themselves, actually, you could say maybe the town of Brantford, we're on the water, so the town of Brantford wants to have like a riverine force, like work with the Coast Guard more and have boats. Okay, fine. If that's what the people of Brantford want, great. If the people of Litchfield want a mountain force because it's pretty mountainous and they want to like do that type of thing, and they want to do cross country skiing in the winter and that's part of their training, knock yourselves out. I'm not going to tell you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting capability, but leaning into the people and the resources that we have, rather than saying, this is a need that I see and we need to have, and this is what you have to do. another way of empowering people at a citizen level, which, is important.
Hmm. The way you're describing this makes me think that your experience in Ukraine during the current iteration of the Ukraine war is informing this a lot. Especially when you're talking about like teaching people how to like hold territory. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what you did there and why you? Am I right that this is where this idea flows from in part? And why do you like? What does that inform how you're doing this?
Yeah, I when the first time I went over there, I went over to the city of Lviv with a couple of veterans and helped them stand up a local city defense force, which is very similar to what I'm thinking about in terms of the town level, the city level state guard. And the folks we trained came from all over, all sorts of different backgrounds: rich, poor, middle class, well educated, not well educated, politically all over the spectrum. And they were all just sort of laser focused on getting ready because at the time we thought, Lviv was probably a couple weeks away for the Russian military. Nobody knew that the Russian military was as feckless or incompetent as they ended up being.
So this was 2022.
2022. And it was different ages too. So you had people who were pretty young, and you had people who were quite a bit older. And that's another thing that I saw when I went back to Ukraine in 2023, and I saw I was training a reconnaissance battalion for the counteroffensive, and I saw people in their 60s. Ukraine had this at the time. I think it made sense what they did, but in retrospect, probably it was a mistake. They did not mobilize the whole society. What they did is they let parents serve instead of their children, and the idea was the youth are our future. We don't want to, every war that we've ever fought, it's been, a meat grinder for the young, and we don't want it to be. So if you're a father or a mother and you'd like to serve in lieu of your children, you can do that. So there is a specific opt out where it's, guys would show up in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and say, yeah, I got 3 sons. Like, I'm doing the service so they don't have to. Honorable. But it also made me think, training them, it was remarkably easy to train them. Like, so easy. They soaked that up. It was easier to train them than it was to train Americans. I think that's because Americans tend to be younger. And when you've got a lifetime of experience working in any type of organization, then learning military stuff is pretty easy. You're sort of like, oh, I'm a plumber. And like, yeah, when I twist this widget, then somebody else has to hold the pipe. And then we call back to the manager, and that's admin. Like, I understand how this unit works.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're 18 years old or 19 years old, you've just been to school, and school is show up and do homework. And it's actually not very much like the military at all. Maybe if you've had, if you were on a sports team, football or something,
Mm-hmm.
you've got some type of unit experience, a group of people working together. But if not, then you don't have a framework for that. And not everybody in the military does, organized sports or should. So I see that voluntary state guard being something where folks can serve in high school, maybe 16 years old, 17 years old. Like, if you've got a driver's license, you can serve in the state guard. But I don't see any maximum age limit. I don't see any fitness requirements. Somebody in a wheelchair who knows how to use QuickBooks can be an administrator. Somebody, who's older but has used computers a lot could be, an IT guy for voluntary state guard. Could pilot a drone. There's a lot of things that people can do that aren't just infantry warrior ethos, lots of push-ups and pull-ups and kettlebell workups. Like, that's one very specific thing, for a military. And it's not, everybody doesn't have to do that. That's a lie. Everybody doesn't have to do that.
So, you know, Russia invades Ukraine, and ordinary people, maybe some have military experience, others don't, come together suddenly to defend their homeland from the foreigners' invasion. So that's admirable. That seems like a natural reaction in a lot of ways. But but having a bunch of Americans come together for an abstract goal of will eventually help dig out from a giant snowstorm, or if there's an earthquake or something like that. And maybe there'll be some military stuff that could possibly happen. It seems harder to me. And also, like, there doesn't seem to me to be an eventuality where, like, people in Connecticut are using guns to defend territory. in which like the entire society hasn't already broken down. Um, and like if we're at that stage, then I don't know what like the police have totally disbanded. There's been some sort of disease outbreak where like 90% of people have died. It seems like you're getting into post-apocalyptic space when because we are not going to be invaded by we don't have neighbors that are threatening land invasion of America. Thankfully, we have two huge oceans and two friendly neighbors, although they're less friendly than they were before Trump's second term. But there's certainly no chance of a land invasion in any of America that I can conceive of with any time and absent something that I can't even imagine. Um, so what, like why do these people need guns? Why do they need like military training? Like why is this not just sort of like why could the plan not be sort of like Boy Scouts for adults or something? And they're doing like community service projects and earning badges and stuff like that. Why does the military aspect or the combat aspect have to be part of it?
Yeah, I mean, this is another great question, and I think I really don't want to like fearmonger. It's not what this isn't about telling people. If I was a fearmonger, I would be saying like, look, guys, 5 years, that's what we got, 3 if we're lucky. And I'm not saying that. I'm not, I don't, I'm like you. I don't, thankfully, any scenario where we are directly threatened by a hostile military force internally or externally is far-fetched. They're all on the far-fetched side of the spectrum. And if they weren't, probably more people would be leaving America. Some people are, but more would be. And it's difficult to even envision on like a 10-year timeline anything, like that happening. It's becoming more possible in the sense of, like you said, our northern and southern neighbors are being kind of antagonized in this way that's frustrating them and annoying them. Um, Russia is close to Canada. China is close to Russia. If we do, through folly and misrule, find ourselves in a large war, in a world war, warfare has become decentralized. And anywhere can expect drone strikes. One of the things that Ukraine has been doing very effectively is, one of the primary roles actually of the guard units that they have there, territorial defenses, is protecting infrastructure from drone strikes. So it's a certain specific type of militia, you could say. And you can shoot down drones. You can shoot down drones with rifle fire or certain types of anti-aircraft. All of those things require military organization. And I guess for me, accepting and acknowledging the fact that not national service, state service, because you're never going to see national service, but some sort of national service at the state level. Connecticut Boy Scouts, like you're saying, Boy Scouts for adults is also a good. I do think that there's a utility in very slowly and methodologically preparing for some type of military eventuality. I think the founders wrote that into the Constitution for a reason. I don't think it's a bad thing for us to have. I know the gun part scares a lot of people, and I understand why. And the proliferation of guns, makes people, particularly people on the left, feel uncomfortable. I get that, and I acknowledge it. And especially the last 20, 25 years since Columbine, it's sort of like, that's another disaster, one disaster after another. But I think, it's you can get a pretty competent military force, 2 weeks at a time, a year at a time, over the course of a decade or 2 decades. And, the European countries that field these, a lot of European countries have these. Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, the Baltics, not countries you think of as like super violent or disorganized. A lot of people I know like to move to places like that. Germany's standing something like this up, a kind of home guard. England isn't, strangely enough. The UK isn't, but they
Well,
also have.
they're an island, and the last time they were invaded was 1066. So
Right, right. But and the other reason, I'm specifically talking about a voluntary state guard is that the governor has the ability to call for a voluntary state guard. So that's actually something I could do as governor day one, even if it manifests initially as something less gun focused or gun heavy and more disaster response. Because it's a voluntary state guard, it doesn't add a line item to the budget. The state legislature isn't involved. So the governor can unilaterally call for a voluntary state guard. That's attractive to me too, because it's something that you can do. I can say, I can promise to do that if elected governor. Most of what the other candidates are talking about are things that are like working with the state legislature to raise taxes or lower taxes, or work on raising or lowering the cost of energy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have not talked about any other issue beyond the one you're focusing on. We're not talking about your position on, abortion policy or education policy or anything, which, the governor ends up controlling a lot of. So I guess my question would be, why, as you acknowledged before we started taping, like this is a long shot campaign, and why have you have an idea, you want to get out there, like why is running for governor the way you want to spread this idea, given the the constraints of running as an independent, and you're not a famous reality show TV host like someone else who came out of nowhere and ran. Why not found a think tank or something that's pursuing these policies?
Because the governor can do it. Because this is the thing. This is actually I think it is a pretty remarkable way to impact culture and society in a good way, for the good and in a positive way, impact communities. It is something going town to town, as I've been campaigning since January. A surprisingly large number of people, not just independents, not just Republicans, but Democrats as well, are seeing as important. And Democrats, I think, more recently, because for a lot of them, what they hear is a way to push back against ICE. And I'm always careful to say, like, that's not what this is for. This is probably more of a way of maybe sucking some of the wind out of this idea of, like, the feds should take care of everything. Federal police, federal military, taxes go up, pay for more capabilities, which used to be a Democratic idea, right? Is that, like, raise taxes, more capabilities. But the way the Trump administration is doing things now, it's raise taxes, more military capabilities, more law enforcement capabilities. I think we can handle a lot of that at the local level with volunteers, and I think that is really important and powerful, and it opens up a type of power to citizens that they haven't had in a long time. That's the best way I can think of to kind of push back on what feels to me like a massive abuse of federal power. That to me is also, like, that's the most urgent thing facing us right now. It's more urgent than what specifically is being taught at schools. It's more urgent than whether taxes go up or down by $500 a year or $1,000 a year. I would prefer them to go down personally, if there's any way, because I'm having trouble keeping up with the taxes that I have. But I've said this, and this isn't the first place I'm saying it. I would never cut taxes without increasing capabilities. Like, cutting taxes means getting rid of capabilities. And I think the way the Trump administration has done that with the federal Department of Education has been horrible. I was a local politician at the town level. So I was an RTM member in Brantford. Something a lot of people don't understand is so much of what people talk about with policy, pushing policy, is like, at the state level or at the federal level, has local impacts. So some of the people that were, like, overjoyed that Trump was president and Doge was in there, Doge was cleaning house, cutting all the fat out of the federal government, axing programs in the Department of Education. We're also surprised to learn that Brantford no longer had like $3 million for this one particular project that was funded by a federal grant. And it's like, what did you think was going to happen when you cut? If you want to cut something, I'm happy to have that conversation about whether that program ought to exist the way it does. But if you're not talking about phasing it out over 5 years or 10 years, you've got this grant, you have teachers who have moved across the country, who have gone to college, gotten degrees to teach in the specific way, and you want to just pull the rug out from under them, that's wrong. That also exists at the state level too. So people want taxes to go down by 5% or 10% or have a flat tax or things like that. And it's just like you cannot. There's no way to do that reasonably. Again, if you want to talk about paying for some capabilities out, I think it's a conversation I'd be willing to have, but you have to have some type of backstop for that. Maybe voluntary capabilities, maybe AI ends up working out the way the people are promising, and it's AGI, and it makes all human effort, unnecessary, and we all get to sort of do whatever we want to do. Well, in such a way, you've got a lot of discretionary time.
Hmm.
Who's going to do things? What is the mechanism for doing anything in that world? And it's volunteering. It's having state and local mechanisms for organizing people to volunteer to do things. That might not just be state guard stuff. It could be like farming. It could be whatever people want to do. It could be building. But we don't currently have that mechanism right now. And the way to start it, I think, is, again, the voluntary state guard.
Hmm. Okay, I think we're probably about at the end of our time. Is there anything else you want to mention, or you have a website? Where can people find you if they live in Connecticut and want to vote for you or want to sign up for your campaign? Where would you direct them?
The campaign website is bonenbergerforgovernor.com. If you've listened to this talk and you're still like, that's not a terrible idea, then you should join. The 50-meter target for me is getting enough petitions signed to get on the ballot. Petitions get issued April 28th. So I'm looking for folks to host petition parties, help me get out and sign petitions. If I get 7,500 petitions, then people will continue to hear me talk about this extremely urgent issue until November, while every other candidate talks about affordability like a normal politician.
Now, I am old enough to remember when Ned Lamont beat Joe Lieberman in the Democratic primary. I think it was 2006, and then Lieberman ran on his own line, which was, I believe, called Connecticut for Lieberman or Lieberman for Connecticut. That was his party. So if you qualified, do you have to come up with a party, or how does that work?
Thankfully, I can. Yeah, that's a great question. I can run. The system incentivizes you to run as part of a party because ballot access is a huge pain in the neck. And if you get ballot access for one election, it carries over to the next election. So getting ballot access for me this election means I could run next election as myself, as an independent unaffiliated, I think, no, I'm sorry. Maybe I've got that backwards. If you're running independent unaffiliated, you have to do it every election. But if you're doing it as part of a party, you get it for the next election too. So it incentivizes you to incorporate in some way or form party. That's not what I'm doing. That's not what I'm interested in doing. I'm not like trying to make some type of political brand. I just have this like Ahab-like monomaniacal vision for a voluntary state guard. I know I'm the right person to do it.
I'm not sure that's the metaphor, just a little political advice. Not sure that's, Ahab is the metaphor you want to be using out on the hustings for various reasons. But yeah, I guess I'm remembering now that the Connecticut for Lieberman party, like Lieberman created just so he could run. He won, and then it sort of lay dormant. And then because of this rule of like it can be a ballot line the next time some guy figured out that like the party was up for grabs and like took it over or something and appeared on the ballot in 2010 or something odd like that did happen. Back when politics was fun. Okay. Well, thank you, Adrian, for coming on and talking about your idea. And people who are interested, go check out Adrian's campaign site. People who enjoyed this content can rate and review, tell their friends. We could form a voluntary organization of fans of Culture Determined that could, help out in local communities. I would discourage people from, carrying arms when they were plugging this podcast, but, you got to be persuasive somehow, I guess. Okay. So thanks, Adrian. Thanks to the viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.